Hey, what's going on, guys, and welcome back to another Fallout 4 modding video. Today we're checking out yet another Commonwealth weaponry expansion release, and that's going to be a brand new heavy late game explosive weapon known as the Incendiary Launcher, or in real life it is known as the M202 Flash. That's right, the big box of destruction. You may recognize this thing as it is pretty popular and has appeared in many games, films, and TV shows. Most notably, you can see this thing in the hands of Arnie in the movie Commando. Now, the purpose of this weapon in real life was, interestingly enough, as a replacement to the flamethrowers used before it. This is because this thing actually fires incendiary rockets that will light up the area in fire. And so we tried to recreate that a little bit in Fallout 4. Matter of fact, we just tried to recreate this weapon the best that we could, as sadly there's not really any animations for this thing, but we did what we could to try to make this thing fit as best as it can in Fallout 4, with some slight design changes. Obviously you're going to have to take some wiggle room here and there to get something close to this weapon working. That being said, I think we did the best we could with what we had, and this is a pretty accurate representation of the weapon with some small tweaks, obviously, for animations. Maybe we could call this a slightly advanced version for the Fallout universe that is a little bit more efficient than the traditional one. I don't know. However you need to make it fit in your game, it's still a pretty good representation of the Flash. Now, in-game, this thing is intended to be a late-game launcher, very similar to the vanilla launcher. In fact, this thing is just going to be very similar to the vanilla launcher, as it has similar animations, a relatively similar damage output, and it does use the same ammo type, as it is going to be using missiles. But there are a handful of differences that make this thing shine and make it a bit different from the missile launcher and thus worth using. I'm not a fan of super redundant weapons in a sandbox, so I tried to make this thing as different as possible. So for starters, this thing is going to have incendiary missiles innately. That's not something you have to add as an attachment. Every missile you fire out of this thing is going to leave a blanket of fire that does damage over time to enemies. So that's going to make it a little bit more powerful than the vanilla launcher. On top of that, this thing is going to have 4 shots right off the bat. Normally that is an upgrade for the vanilla missile launcher. You have 1, then 3, then 4, but this one has 4 immediately. That being said, you can't get any more than 4. So it is going to be more powerful right off the bat, but it's going to have different kinds of upgrades at the weapons workbench to change how it performs. It's a little bit more different in terms of customization and attachments than the vanilla missile launcher, having some different tweaks you can make to change how this weapon performs slightly. In terms of raw damage, by the way, I said this thing does some damage over time. The initial explosion is going to be very similar to that of the traditional missile launcher, but then it has that damage over time with fire on top of that. So it's going to have a similar damage output immediately, but then it's going to burn enemies over time, and making this thing pretty strong, which also makes it pretty strong against you. So make sure not to shoot this thing at super close ranges, as not only is the initial explosion going to hurt, but the fire actually burns you really fast. This thing is kind of strong. Now, because of that, it is, like I said, a late game weapon, and thus it is integrated into the late game. As usual, this thing is added to the leveled lists and can be found on Gunner and Raider bosses, only the bosses, and it can also be found on super mutants. Of course, you can also purchase this thing from shops, all of these options being available after level 24. On top of that integration, there's also a handful of uniques that are spread across the world that you can find. We'll talk about those a bit more when we break this weapon down, which we are actually going to start doing right about now as we head over to check out this weapon's stats. So here we are in game with the Incendiary Launcher. And as you can see, this thing has a nice set of stats with a base damage of 123, and you'll notice an energy damage of 11. That is actually how it calculates the fire damage that is left behind. For some reason, fire in this game doesn't actually use the incendiary damage. It uses the electrical damage, or rather the energy damage, my bad. But I'm not sure why they decided to do that in vanilla, but we tried to mimic vanilla weapons the best we could, as opposed to making our own things, as there is no enemy in the game that has innate incendiary resistance, and that would make this thing a tad bit overpowered. So energy damage it is. Now, this thing does use missiles, like I said before, so that means there is no munitions requirement for this guy. Additionally, this thing has a fire rate of 25. You can spew these rockets out at a pretty decent speed. A range of 155, an accuracy of 61, a weight of 16.4 pounds, which is fitting of a big launcher like this, and a value of 366 caps. And as you can see, this weapon is pretty cool. Notably, the biggest difference here is that it is going to have a removable magazine here, as opposed to taking off the clips of tubes in the back like you would in real life. So we've changed the design a little bit and made these an integral part of the design to have the classic silhouette, but you do remove the magazine up here. Besides that, this thing is a pretty cool representation of the Flash, I've got to say. Even though it is just a big cube, I am pretty proud of this thing. Now then, let's check out some of the uniques available in this mod. Starting off with one of my favorites, the Commando. Obviously a reference to the movie Commando, this thing has its own custom paint job based on the face paint that Arnie had in the movie. This thing is really, really cool. It comes with the classic attachments like the big scope there, and it's a lot of fun to use. This thing has a unique legendary effect that says it does more damage the lower your armor resistance. Now, this is a reference in multiple ways. First of all, in the film Commando, Arnie is wearing basically nothing. He's got a vest on and no shirt. Pretty funny, so the lower your armor resistance, the more damage it does. But on top of that, if you're familiar with the term going commando, meaning wearing basically no clothes, this is again going to do more damage. In fact, the most effective this weapon is when you have no clothes on. So running around naked with a rocket launcher is actually a viable build with this weapon. If you'd like to get your hands on this particular unique, you can do so actually over at Gunner's Plaza. Now, the next unique we have is known as the Black Box. This one is a TF2 reference. Ignore how funky the skin looks here, I talk about this a lot, but black shows up weird in these preview menus. It looks perfectly fine in-game. Now again, this thing is very, very similar to its TF2 counterpart, though it does have some differences. In TF2, this thing shoots 3 rockets, whereas ours still shoots 4, so it's actually a tad bit better. It does share an all-black paint job, and it does have a chance to heal you every time you shoot somebody with it. So as you shoot enemies, it's actually going to potentially, based on a 50% chance, heal you some health back, which is pretty neat. But it is going to cost you a missile every time you try to get that chance, so it's not too overpowered. It's not like you don't need stim packs anymore. Now, if you'd like to get your hands on this one, it's actually over on the Pridwin, being sold by Proctor Teagan, so you are going to have to get into the Brotherhood at least a little bit to purchase this thing, but you don't have to stick with them to the end of the game. And finally, that leaves the Raider variant known as the Nefarious Napalmer. As you can see, this thing has a nice Raider paint job, all red with some markings. Pretty fun little guy, and then of course a big set of spikes on the front end here. And this thing does 50% more damage against humans, making it a little bit more of a generic legendary, but a little bit more of a powerful one at the same time. So it's pretty cool. A nice little damage boost if you are fighting humanoid enemies. Now, if you want to get your hands on this one, it's actually found over at the Roadside Pine Motel, where there is already an enemy that typically has a missile launcher, so you're going to find this thing over there. Now, even though this thing does have vanilla animations, I'm still going to show it off as I want you to be able to see it for yourself and any bits of clipping or whatever it might have, just to determine if it is something you want to have in your load order. So, for this thing, we have the quad barrel missile launcher animation set. They work pretty well on this thing. Obviously, there's a handle that normally wouldn't be there, but it's kind of what you need for the anim set. All things considered, I think that's not a too bad of a compromise for this kind of weapon. Now let's also talk about accuracy. Since this is a missile launcher, accuracy is not really that important. You fire this thing in the general vicinity of enemies and it's probably going to hit them. And if not, then the fire will get them afterwards. Now, one thing while we're here I do want to show off is that flame over time effect. So if you hit enemies, they will burn. Let's go ahead and get a Deathclaw here. And you'll see that there is going to be an initial explosion that does a lot of damage, but then also there is damage over time. On a Deathclaw, it's kind of minor, but you can see that it is slowly burning. Its health is going down. But you can stack this effect if you hit it with more than one. So that's the purpose of having 4 barrels. As you see, its health is still going relatively slowly, but it is going down. It's going to be a lot more effective on humanoid enemies. The Deathclaw may not have been the best example, but as you can see, its health is still going down. There is many, many times that I have shot at enemies in combat, and I thought that I needed to hit them with one more missile, but then the fire actually finished them off. So this thing definitely does work and do exactly what it's supposed to do. So, definitely a little bit of an upgrade to the missile launcher, but you can upgrade it further over at the weapons workbench. Let's go ahead and check that out now. So over at the weapons workbench, we have a handful of attachments, not as much as our typical mods, but definitely more than the vanilla missile launcher has access to. Starting off with a receiver category. Now typically explosive weapons don't have receiver upgrades, but ours does. And they have different tweaks than you'd expect, because damage cannot really be modified this way without changing the projectile record, which we definitely don't want to do. So, rather than upgrading the damage of this weapon, which is based on that projectile explosion record, this is going to change the way the weapon functions in other ways. So the calibrated receiver is going to give you better critical shot damage, the hair trigger receiver gives you a faster fire rate, light frame is going to be a lighter weight but reduced damage, and then heavy frame is going to give you a heavier weight but a slightly improved damage. So they are a little bit of an inverted trade-off there. We do have some different barrel options. We have the standard barrel, which is, well, no barrel, really. The bayoneted barrel is going to give you a bunch of spikes on the front for better bash damage. The long barrel is going to be a tube extension that you can throw on the front of this guy. The heavy barrel is going to be basically the same thing, but it's going to mirror the silhouette of the rest of the weapon. And then a set of stabilized barrels, which are going to give you better accuracy and recoil, as there are 4 gigantic stabilizers on the front of this weapon. Pretty funny looking, but they definitely do work. Then for grips, we do have a handful of options, including the standard wood grips. We have some heavy grips made out of painted black metal. Again, looks weird in the preview menu, but it looks a lot better in-game. And then the light grips, which is my favorite set here, offering a nice black plastic with a big red trigger. Pretty cool. For sights, we have the standard set of iron sights, a laser sight, yes, a laser sight, a reflex sight, and a short scope, being the classic attachment for this guy. I thought we were going to have a handful more of reflex sights, but they would be kind of redundant, just different aesthetics, so we just have this one for now. And then finally, that leaves the accessory slot, which has a handful of charms. You may have seen this in a couple of our other mods. Since this weapon doesn't have a ton of attachments, these are going to give you a nice little boost depending on which one you pick. Strength is going to give you more bash, perception is going to give you better range, endurance is going to give you more damage resistance while you hold this weapon. I think that's probably one of my favorites for this setup. Charisma is going to give you a better intimidation chance, which makes sense when you're holding a rocket launcher like this. Intelligence will give you better critical rates, agility will give you a faster reload speed, and luck will improve your critical damage once again. Pairing this with a certain receiver may give you some really high critical damage. Even if you get some more legendary drops on top of that, this thing could be a pretty powerful VATS weapon. So yeah guys, that is the Incendiary Launcher, otherwise known as the M202 Flash, a pretty fun addition to Fallout 4 Sandbox. Trying to make an explosive weapon that feels unique from the missile launcher is a bit difficult, especially with my balancing style, but I think we achieved something pretty cool. So if you want to try this weapon out for yourself, as always, it will be linked down in the description below. It is on Nexus right now, and it may be on Xbox sometime soon, or it may be there already. I'm not really sure. I don't handle the porting side of stuff, but you can always check and see if it's there. If it's not, it'll probably be there sometime very soon. As always, if you enjoy the mod, consider dropping it an endorsement, and if you enjoyed this video, give it a like. It really helps out the channel, and it helps out the mod if you do so, but of course, it's always optional. Speaking of which, if you'd like to support my work directly, you can do so using the link down in the description to check me out on Patreon. But again, that is also completely optional. Just a donation service for those of you who are into that kind of thing. With that, I hope you guys enjoyed as always, and I will see you all in the next one. Peace!